The holy water had barely touched the baby's forehead when the voice cut through the cathedral like a blade. "Stop this ceremony. That child is illegitimate." Every head in St. Catherine's Cathedral turned. The organ music stuttered and died. 200 guests sat frozen in polished wooden pews, their mouths hanging open, their champagne flute still raised from the toast they'd been about to give, and there, standing at the end of the center aisle in a tailored charcoal suit with a silk pocket square, was Gregory Ashworth III, the baby's own father, pointing a finger at his wife and newborn son like they were strangers he'd caught trespassing in his home. Alina Ashworth stood at the baptismal font, her baby cradled against her chest. She was wearing a cream-colored dress she'd sewn herself because Gregory had frozen her credit cards 3 weeks before the christening. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid. She had no jewelry, no designer shoes, no entourage of stylists. She had only her son, her dignity, and a secret that not a single person in that cathedral, except one, knew the full truth about. Archbishop Thomas Moreau stood behind the font, his hands still wet with holy water. He was 71 years old, had served the church for nearly 5 decades, and had baptized over 6,000 children. But he had never, not once in all those years, witnessed a father try to publicly disown his own child during a christening. He looked at Gregory, he looked at Alina, and then he looked down at the baby, sleeping peacefully, unaware that his life had just become the centerpiece of a scandal that would unravel one of the most powerful families on the eastern seaboard. Archbishop knew the truth. He'd known it for months, and today, God willing, the truth was going to set someone free. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how this moment came to be, how a christening in one of America's most prestigious cathedrals turned into a public execution of one woman's character, you have to go back to the beginning, back to the night Alina Vasquez first met Gregory Ashworth, and made the mistake that would define the next 4 years of her life. She thought she was falling in love. She was really falling into a trap. Alina Vasquez grew up in a small apartment above a bakery in a working-class neighborhood in Providence, Rhode Island. Her mother, Rosa, was a seamstress who took in alterations and mending work. Her father, Miguel, had been a carpenter who died from a lung condition when Alina was 14. They never had much, but Rosa kept that apartment spotless, kept food on the table, and kept Alina in school with the kind of fierce determination that only a widowed immigrant mother can summon. Alina was brilliant. Not just smart, brilliant. She won a full scholarship to Brown University, where she studied biomedical engineering. She graduated summa cum laude. She was offered a position at a medical device startup in Boston where she helped design a surgical tool that would later be patented and used in hospitals across the country. By the age of 27, Alina Vasquez had her name on 3 patents, a growing savings account, and the quiet respect of people in her field who recognized raw talent when they saw it. But Alina was also kind, dangerously kind. The kind that makes you forgive people who don't deserve it. The kind that makes you see the best in someone even when everyone else is seeing the warning signs. And it was that kindness, that deep, inherited, Rosa taught kindness that opened with a door for Gregory Ashworth to walk into her life. They met at a charity gala in Newport. Alina had been invited by a colleague because the startup she worked for had donated equipment to a children's hospital. She wore a borrowed dress. Gregory wore a $12,000 tuxedo. He was tall, dark-haired, square-jawed, and had the kind of confident smile that made people feel like they were the only person in the room. He was also the sole heir to the Ashworth fortune, a real estate empire built by his grandfather, expanded by his father, and maintained by an army of accountants, lawyers, and yes-men who kept Gregory's world polished to a mirror shine. Gregory approached Alina at the bar. He told her she was the most interesting person he'd talked to all night. He asked her what she did for a living. When she told him about her work in biomedical engineering, he leaned in and said, "You're not just beautiful, you're brilliant." And Alina, who had spent her entire life being told she'd never amount to anything by kids in her neighborhood, by professors who underestimated her, by a world that looked at a working-class Latina and assumed she'd end up behind a register. Alina heard those words and felt something inside her soften. She didn't fall for his money. She fell for the way he made her feel seen. They dated for 6 months. Gregory was charming. He sent flowers. He remembered the little things, her mother's birthday, her favorite order at the coffee shop near her lab, the way she liked to walk along the harbor at dusk and talk about the stars. He introduced her to his world. The galas, the country clubs, the weekend trips to his family's estate in the Berkshires. And for a while it was magical. Alina felt like she'd stepped into a fairy tale, But fairy tales have villains, and Gregory's villain was hiding behind that perfect smile. The first sign came 2 months into their relationship. At a dinner party at the Ashworth estate, Gregory's mother, Vivian Ashworth, looked Alina up and down when they were introduced, and said, with a kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, "How lovely." Gregory has always had a soft spot for charity cases. Alina laughed it off. Gregory squeezed her hand under the table and whispered, "Ignore her. She's like that with everyone." But she wasn't like that with everyone. She was like that with Alina. Every time they visited her, Vivian found a way to remind Alina where she came from. She'd ask if Alina's mother still took in laundry. She'd comment on Alina's accent, even though Alina barely had one. She'd make references to our kind of people and then glance at Alina as if to say, "You're not one of us." Gregory never defended her, not once. Instead, he'd tell Alina later, in private, that she was being too sensitive. That his mother was just old-fashioned. That things would get better once they were married. And Alina, who loved him, who wanted to believe him, nodded and swallowed her hurt the way her mother had taught her to swallow hardship quietly. With her chin up, they married 11 months after they met, in a ceremony at the Ashworth family, estate that cost more than Elena's mother earned in a decade. Rosa sat in the front row in a dress she'd sewn herself, crying silent tears of joy. Vivian sat on the other side, in chenille, crying nothing. After the wedding, things changed. It started small. Gregory suggested Elena leave her job to focus on the family. Elena loved her work, but Gregory framed it as a sacrifice for their future. He said he wanted her home when they had children. He said the startup was beneath someone with her last name, her new last name. Elena resisted at first, but Gregory had a way of making his suggestions feel like inevitabilities. He didn't argue, he just maneuvered. He'd schedule vacations. During her work deadlines, he'd invite clients to dinner on nights she had late shifts. He'd sigh when she came home tired and say, "I just miss you, that's all." Within a year, Elena had left the job that had given her purpose, identity, and financial independence. She was now a full-time wife in a mansion she didn't feel at home in, surrounded by people who treated her like an accessory. And Gregory, the man who'd once made her feel like the most important person in the room, had started making her feel like the least. The financial control came next. Gregory put her on an allowance. He said it was for household expenses, but the amount was insultingly small for someone living in a $12 million home. When Elena asked for access to their shared accounts, Gregory laughed and said, "You don't need to worry about the money, sweetheart. That's my department." When she pushed back, his tone changed. "I built this life. I maintain this life. You enjoy this life. Let's keep things simple." Elena was isolated. Her old colleagues had moved on. Her friends from college had drifted away. Gregory always had a reason they couldn't visit. Always had a comment about how those people didn't understand their world. Rosa was 2 hours away and didn't drive. Elena spent her days in a mansion that echoed with silence, scrolling through photos of the woman she used to be, wondering where she'd gone, and then she got pregnant. Elena had wanted children her whole life. When the test came back positive, she wept with joy. She called Gregory at work, her voice trembling with excitement. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then he said, flatly, "We'll discuss it at dinner." At dinner, Gregory sat across from her at their long mahogany dining table and said, "The timing isn't great, Elena. I have the Singapore deal closing this quarter. I don't need distractions." Distractions. He called their unborn child a distraction. Elena kept a baby. That was never a question. But from that moment forward, she noticed a shift in Gregory that chilled her to the bone. He became distant. He worked later. He traveled more. He stopped touching her. When she reached for his hand, he'd pull away. When she showed him ultrasound photos, he'd glance at them and say, "Looks fine," and go back to his phone. And when she was 6 months pregnant, swollen and exhausted and glowing with the kind of beauty that comes from carrying life inside you, Elena found the text messages. Gregory was having an affair with Natasha Kensington. Natasha was everything. Vivian Ashworth wanted for her son, old money, blue blood, Princeton, a family name that went back to the Mayflower. She was tall, blonde, impeccably dressed, and she'd been circling Gregory since before the wedding. Elena had seen her at parties, the way she lingered too close, the way she laughed too loud at Gregory's jokes, the way she looked at Elena like she was a placeholder. The messages were explicit, not just physical, emotional. Gregory told Natasha he'd made a mistake, that he should have married her. that Elena was a phase he was trying to get through, and the one that broke Elena, the one that made her hand shake so badly she dropped the phone, was the message where Gregory wrote, "She's carrying the baby to term. Once it's born, I'll push for a divorce. You and I can start over. BT. Real life begins after this one ends." Elena sat on the bathroom floor of that $12 million mansion, 6 months pregnant, reading those words over and over until the letters blurred through her tears, and something inside her broke. But something else, something harder, something fiercer, something that Rosa Vasquez had planted in her daughter's spine like a steel rod. That something held. She didn't confront him. Not yet. She knew that if she confronted Gregory now, without a plan, without protection, he would use every weapon in his arsenal, his money, his lawyers, his mother, his name, to destroy her. He would take the baby, he would take everything, and Elena would be left exactly where Vivian Ashworth always said she belonged. Nowhere. Elena did what brilliant women do when the world underestimates them. She got quiet, she got strategic, and she started building an escape. The first person she called was her old mentor from the startup, Dr. Catherine Park. Catherine was a patent attorney who'd helped Elena file her early work. Elena asked her a simple question. "Those patents I designed during my time at Medvance, who owns the intellectual property?" Catherine's answer changed everything. "You do, Elena. The employment contract you signed had a clause that retained partial ownership for independently developed innovations. 2 of your 3 patents qualify. You didn't just contribute to those designs, you invented them. And one of them, the cardiac microsutro tool, has been licensed to 9 hospitals and is generating significant royalty income. That's been going into a trust." Elena's voice was barely a whisper. "What trust?" "The trust Dr. Emerson set up at Medvance when you left. He believed in your work, Elena. He wanted to make sure you'd always have something. The royalties have been accumulating for 3 years. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but, Elena, ... It's not small." Elena hung up the phone and sat in silence for a very long time. She was not the penniless wife Gregory believed her to be. She had never been what any of them thought she was, and now, she had options. Over the next 3 months, Elena moved carefully. She contacted a family law attorney, not one from the Ashworth Rolodex, but one she found on her own, a woman named Judith Crane who specialized in high divorces and had a reputation for protecting women who'd been financially controlled by powerful husbands. Elena gave Judith everything: the text messages, the financial records she'd quietly photographed from Gregory's home office, the documentation of her patent royalties, and a detailed account of the emotional abuse she'd endured. Judith looked at the evidence and said, "Elena, when this goes to court, Gregory Ashworth is not going to know what hit him." But Elena wasn't ready for court. Not yet. She had one more thing to take care of first. And it happened, of all places, in a confessional. Elena had always been a woman of faith. Not the performative faith of the Ashworth family, the kind that shows up in the society pages and writes checks with press releases, but the quiet, private, on-your-knees-at-midnight kind of faith that carries you through the worst nights of your life. And one Wednesday evening, when Gregory was in New York on business, which Elena now understood meant he was in Natasha's apartment, Elena drove to St. Catherine's Cathedral. She hadn't been there in months. Gregory had stopped attending Mass shortly after the wedding, and he didn't like Elena going without him. "It looks odd," he'd say. "People will think we're having problems." But that night Elena didn't care what it looked like. She needed to sit in a quiet place and talk to God. Or, at the very least, to someone who would listen. She slipped into the confessional. On the other side of the screen was Archbishop Thomas Moreau. Elena didn't plan to tell him everything. She planned to confess her anger, her resentment, her fear. But once she started talking, the words poured out of her like water from a cracked dam. She told him about Gregory, about the affair, about the financial control, about Vivian's cruelty, about the baby growing inside her and the terrifying possibility that she might have to raise this child alone, in a world that had already decided she was nobody. Archbishop Moreau listened. He listened with the patience of a man who had heard 10,000 confessions and knew that sometimes the holiest thing you can do is simply not interrupt. And when Elena finally stopped, her voice raw, her face streaked with tears, the Archbishop said something she did not expect. "My child, I knew your father." Elena froze. "What?" "Miguel Vasquez. He was the carpenter who restored the choir loft in this very cathedral 20 years ago. He spent 6 months on that work. Every joint was perfect. Every board was level. He could have rushed it. The diocese was pressuring him to finish early. But your father said, and I remember his exact words, Archbishop, God doesn't live in crooked houses. He was a man of extraordinary integrity. And from what you've just told me, his daughter inherited every ounce of it. Elena wept. She wept for her father. She wept for her mother. She wept for the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become and the child, who was about to enter a world that could be so unspeakably cruel. And then Archbishop Moreau said, Elena, I want you to listen to me very carefully. When that baby is born, you bring him here. I will baptize him myself. And I promise you on my oath before God that no one will dishonor that child in this cathedral. Not while I'm standing at the altar. Elena didn't know it then, but that promise would become the most important one anyone had ever made to her. The baby came on a Tuesday in March. A boy, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, dark eyes like his mother, a full head of black hair. Elena named him Miguel, after her father. Gregory didn't come to the hospital until the following day, and when he arrived, he barely looked at the baby. He signed the birth certificate, took a phone call in the hallway, and left within the hour. Rosa came and stayed for 2 weeks. She held her grandson and sang to him the same songs she'd sung to Elena, and for those 2 weeks, the mansion felt less like a prison and more like a home. But when Rosa left, the silence returned, heavier than before. Gregory's behavior grew worse. He was openly contemptuous now. He'd refer to Elena as the nanny in front of his friends. He'd leave the room when baby Miguel cried. He started sleeping in a separate bedroom, and when Elena confronted him about it, he said, I need my rest. Some of us actually work. And then came the christening. It was Vivian's idea, of course it was. She wanted a grand event at St. Catherine's, 200 guests, a string quartet, a reception at the Ashworth estate afterward. She wanted it photographed for the society section. She wanted it to be an Ashworth event, not an Elena event. And Gregory agreed, because Gregory always agreed with his mother when it came to matters of appearance. Elena agreed too, but for a different reason. She agreed because Archbishop Moreau would be there, and she had learned, in the weeks since Miguel's birth, that the Archbishop had been doing something extraordinary he'd been investigating. Archbishop Moreau was not just a man of the cloth. Before entering the seminary at 23, he had studied law at Georgetown. He still had contacts in the legal world, in the financial world, and crucially in the world of the records, which kept meticulous documentation of donations, charitable trusts, and family histories. And when Elena had told him her story in the confessional, something about the Ashworth name had nagged at him. He couldn't share what he'd heard. In confession, the seal was absolute, but he could pursue his own independent inquiry. And what he found shook him. The Ashworth fortune, the empire that Gregory's grandfather, Charles Ashworth, had supposedly built from the ground up, had a very different origin story than the one the family told at cocktail parties. Charles Ashworth hadn't built his real estate empire alone. He'd had a partner, a silent partner who'd provided the seed capital, the construction expertise, and the labor connections that made the first 5 buildings possible. That partner's name was Tomas Vasquez, Elena's grandfather. The Archbishop found the records buried in diocesan archives, old parish files from the 1960s. When Tomas Vasquez had approached the church for help mediating a business dispute, Tomas had invested his life savings, the money he'd earned as a master builder after immigrating from Mexico, into a partnership with Charles Ashworth. Together, they'd developed 5 commercial properties in downtown Providence. But when the profits started rolling in, Charles had maneuvered Tomas out. He'd used a clause in their handshake agreement, they'd never had a formal contract, to claim sole ownership. Tomas fought it, but he was an immigrant without legal resources in 1960s America. And the courts sided with the man whose last name sounded like old money. Tomas Vasquez lost everything. He died 10 years later, broken and poor. His son, Miguel, Elena's father, grew up without knowing the full story. Rosa knew pieces of it, but the pain was too deep, and the family had buried it along with their pride. The Ashworth fortune was built on stolen ground, and the woman Gregory Ashworth was trying to throw away was the granddaughter of the man who'd made that fortune possible. Archbishop Moreau sat with this knowledge for weeks. He prayed about it. He consulted with legal scholars within the church. He reviewed the documents again and again, and he came to a conclusion. The truth needed to come out. Not from the pulpit, not from a confession, but in a way that honored both God's justice and the law of man. He reached out to Judith Crane. What Elena didn't know was that her attorney and the Archbishop had been in quiet communication for over a month before the christening. Judith had independently discovered financial irregularities in the Ashworth estate, evidence that Gregory had been hiding assets, underreporting income, and funneling money into offshore accounts to protect it from any potential divorce settlement. Combined with the Archbishop's historical findings about the Vasquez-Ashworth partnership, Judith had assembled a case that was, in her words, a legal earthquake waiting to happen. Her christening was set for the first Sunday in June. Invitations were sent on cream-colored cardstock with the Ashworth crest embossed in gold. The guest list read like a who's who of East Coast society. Senators, CEOs, old money families whose names were on buildings and hospital wings. Vivian Ashworth personally approved every name and vetted every +1. She wanted this day to be perfect. She wanted the world to see the Ashworth legacy continuing, golden and unblemished. She had no idea that the day would end with that legacy in ruins. The morning of the christening, Elena woke early. She fed McGee, she dressed him in a white christening gown that Rosa had hand-embroidered with tiny crosses and roses, a family tradition that went back 3 generations. She looked at her son's face and whispered, "Today is for your grandfather, both of them." She put on her cream dress, the one she'd sewn herself, and she drove to the cathedral with Rosa in the passenger seat and Miguel in the back, sleeping. In his car seat, she did not ride in the Ashworth limousine. She did not walk in on Gregory's arm. She arrived alone with her mother. And she walked through those cathedral doors with her chin up and her baby against her heart. Gregory was already there, standing near the front with Vivian and his groomsmen, 2 of whom had helped him cover his affair. Natasha Kensington was seated in the 4th row, wearing a hat that cost more than Elena's car. She was smiling. Actually smiling. As if she'd already won. The ceremony began. Archbishop Moreau stood at the baptismal font in his full vestments, the white cope, the golden stole, the mitre that caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows. He welcomed the congregation. He spoke about the sacrament of baptism, about the promise of new life, about the covenant between a child and God. His voice was warm and steady, the voice of a man who had spoken these words thousands of times, and still meant every single one. And then he turned to Elena and said, "Please bring the child forward." Elena stepped to the font. She cradled Miguel in her arms and tilted him gently so the Archbishop could reach his forehead. The cathedral was hushed. 200 people held their breath, and that's when Gregory spoke. "Stop this ceremony." Words rang off the stone walls like a gunshot. Elena turned. The Archbishop turned. Every guest turned. Gregory was standing in the center aisle, his jaw set, his eyes blazing with a fury that Elena recognized, the cold, calculated fury of a man who believed the world existed to obey him. "That child is illegitimate," Gregory said, "and I will not allow the Ashworth name to be attached to a fraud." A gasp rolled through the cathedral like a wave. Rosa clutched the edge of the pew. Vivian sat perfectly still, her face a mask of porcelain composure, but her eyes were bright with satisfaction. This was planned, Elena could see it. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. Gregor and Vivian had choreographed this. They'd chosen the most public possible moment, the most sacred possible setting to humiliate her. Gregory walked forward, his shoes clicking on the marble floor. He stopped 10 feet from the font and looked at Elena with a contempt so pure, it could have curdled holy water. "I have reason to believe," he said, projecting his voice so every person in the cathedral could hear, "that the child Elena is presenting for baptism is not my son. I have consulted with my attorneys, and I am formally requesting a paternity test before this ceremony proceeds. Until that test is completed, I am withdrawing my consent for this baptism." The murmuring in the pews grew louder. Some guests were already reaching for their phones. Elena stood at the font, holding Miguel, and she felt the ground tilt beneath her. Not because she was afraid. She had nothing to hide. Miguel was Gregory's son, biologically, legally, and in every way that mattered. But Gregory didn't know that. Or rather, he didn't care. This wasn't about truth. This was about control. This was about punishing Elena for daring to exist in a world he believed belonged to him. Elena looked at Gregory, and for the first time in their entire relationship, she didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She didn't swallow her hurt. She looked him dead in the eye and said, quietly but clearly, "Are you finished?" Gregory blinked. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected tears. He'd expected begging. He'd expected the meek, grateful girl he'd married to crumble under the weight of public shame. But that girl was gone. In her place stood a woman with steel in her spine and fire in her eyes, a woman who had been underestimated for the last time. Before Gregory could respond, Archbishop Moreau raised his hand. The cathedral fell silent. "Mr. Ashworth," the Archbishop said, his voice carrying the weight of 5 decades of moral authority. "This is the house of God. You are standing in the nave of a cathedral that has witnessed baptisms, weddings, and funerals for over 150 years. Every child who has been brought to this font has been received with love and dignity, regardless of the circumstances of their birth. I will not allow you to turn this sacred space into a stage for your personal grievances." Gregory's face reddened. "With all due respect, Archbishop, this is a family matter." "No, sir," the Archbishop replied. "The moment you made it public, it ceased to be a family matter. You have made an accusation against this child and his mother in front of 200 witnesses, in a place of worship. And I am telling you now that accusation is not only cruel, it is false." The silence that followed was so absolute, you could hear the candles flickering. Gregory's attorney, who had been sitting in the second row, stood up. "Archbishop, my client has concerns about the paternity of..." "Sit down," the Archbishop said, not loudly, not angrily, just ... with authority. The kind of authority that doesn't come from a courtroom or a boardroom, but from something much older and much deeper. The attorney sat down. Archbishop Moreau turned to the congregation. "I ask for your patience," he said. "What I am about to share is not part of the baptismal, right? But it is part of the truth. And the truth, as Scripture tells us, shall set you free." He reached beneath the lectern and produced a leather folder. Elena recognized it. She'd seen it in Judith Crane's office. Her heart began to pound. "Several months ago," the Archbishop began, "I became aware of a profound injustice, one that has been buried for over 60 years. It involves 2 families. The Ashworth family, who are well known to this congregation and to this community, and the Vasquez family, who are perhaps less well known but no less worthy of recognition." He opened the folder. In 1962, a man named Tomas Vasquez entered into a business partnership with Charles Ashworth, Gregory's grandfather. Tomas provided the seed capital and the construction expertise that built the first 5 properties in what would become the Ashworth real estate empire. He was, in every meaningful sense, a co-founder of the Ashworth fortune. Vivian's mask cracked, her eyes widened, her hand gripped the pew in front of her. But Charles Ashworth betrayed his partner. He used the absence of a formal contract to claim sole ownership of the properties. Tomas Vasquez, an immigrant without legal resources, was pushed out. He lost everything. He died in poverty. His family, including his son Miguel Vasquez and his granddaughter Elena, never received a cent of the fortune they helped create. The Archbishop paused. He let the words settle over the congregation like dust. "Elena Vasquez Ashworth," he continued, turning to look at her directly, "is not a charity case. She is not a gold digger. She is not a fraud. She is the granddaughter of a man who built the very foundation that the Ashworth family stands on. And the child she is holding, Miguel Ashworth, carries the blood of both families. He is not illegitimate. He is in fact more legitimate than any Ashworth in this room." The cathedral erupted. Whispers became murmurs. Murmurs became gasps. Phones were out. Society columnists were typing furiously. Gregory stood in the aisle, his face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a man who'd forgotten how to speak. But the Archbishop wasn't done. "Furthermore," he said, reaching into the folder again, "I have been provided with documentation, independently verified, that Mr. Griggy Ashworth has engaged in a pattern of financial misconduct, including the concealment of marital asset, the funneling of funds to offshore accounts, and the deliberate financial isolation of his wife during her pregnancy. This documentation has been submitted to the appropriate legal authorities." Gregory's attorney was on his feet again. "It is outrageous. This is a church, not a courtroom." "You're right," the Archbishop said. "It's a church. And in a church, we tell the truth." He turned to Gregory one last time. "Mr. Ashworth, you came here today to publicly shame your wife and disown your son. You chose this place. You chose this audience. You chose this moment. So let me be clear, in front of everyone you tried to impress. Your wife is a brilliant woman with her own patents, her own income, and her own legacy. Your son is healthy, loved, and wanted. And your marriage, whatever becomes of it, will be adjudicated by courts. that now have the full picture of who you are and what you've done. This christening will proceed, and you, sir, may either stay and witness it in silence, or leave. Those are your only options. Gregory looked around the cathedral. He looked at the faces of his guests, faces that had once admired him, envied him, sought his approval. Now those faces looked at him with something else entirely. Some with shock, some with pity, some with barely concealed disgust. He looked at Natasha, who was already gathering her purse, her face pale. The fantasy of her future with Gregory evaporating in real time. He looked at his mother, who was staring straight ahead, her jaw tight, a world collapsing around her in a way no amount of Chanel could cushion. And then he looked at Elena. She was standing at the font, holding their son, and she was looking at him not with anger, not with triumph, but with something worse, something he couldn't fight or buy or manipulate. She was looking at him with peace, with the calm, steady peace of a woman who had already won. Gregory turned. He walked back down the aisle. His shoes clicked on the marble, each step echoing louder. In the silence, he pushed through the cathedral doors, and they closed behind him with a sound like a gavel falling. Archbishop Moreau turned back to Elena. He smiled. "Shall we continue?" Elena nodded. A single tear slid down her cheek, but she was smiling. The Archbishop lifted the silver shell from the font. He poured holy water over Miguel's forehead 3 times. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The baby blinked, startled, then settled back into his mother's arms. The congregation exhaled as one. "I baptize you, Miguel Thomas Ashworth," the Archbishop said, his voice resonant and gentle. He'd added the middle name without being asked. Thomas, his own name, because some promises are sacred. Rosa wept, openly. The women in the pews wept with her. Even the men, the senators and CEOs in their fine suits, even some of them wiped their eyes, because they had just witnessed something rare, a moment of real justice, in a real place, in real time. No court order, no settlement check, just the truth, spoken aloud, in a cathedral. After the ceremony, Elena was surrounded, not by photographers or gossip columnists, though there were plenty of those. She was surrounded by people, strangers, mostly, who came up to her and took her hand and said things like, "You're incredible," and "Your father would be proud," and "If there's anything I can do." One woman, a silver-haired attorney, named Margaret Ellis, who sat on the board of 3 hospitals, pressed a card into Elena's hand and said, "I've been following your patent work for years. Call me Monday. We should talk about a seat on my foundation board." Another man, quiet, unassuming, wearing a simple grey suit, waited until the crowd had thinned. He introduced himself as David Chun, a historian who specialized in immigrant contributions to American industry. He'd been invited to the christening by a mutual friend and had nearly not come. "I've been researching cases exactly like your grandfather's for 20 years, he said. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to help tell his story. The full story. The one that was stolen from him." Elena agreed. Of course she agreed, because that was always what this was about. Not revenge, not money, not winning. It was about restoration. It was about taking back a story that had been erased and writing it back into the record where it belonged. The weeks that followed the christening were a whirlwind. The story went viral, not just in the society pages but everywhere. A video someone had taken on their phone, shaky, imperfect, but undeniably real, captured the entire confrontation. Gregory's accusation, the Archbishop's response, Elena's quiet dignity. It was viewed 14 million times in the first week. The comments section became a testament to how deeply the story resonated. People shared their own stories of being underestimated, betrayed, silenced. Elena became, almost overnight, a symbol not of victimhood but of resilience. Gregory, meanwhile, was in freefall. The financial documents the Archbishop had referenced were now in the hands of federal investigators. The offshore accounts were frozen. His attorneys were scrambling. The Ashworth Board of Directors, alarmed by the PR disaster and the legal exposure, voted to remove Gregory as CEO of Ashworth Properties and replace him with an outside consultant. For the first time in 3 generations, there was no Ashworth at the head of the Ashworth table. Vivian tried to do damage control. She gave an interview to a sympathetic magazine, claiming the christening had been a private family misunderstanding blown out of proportion. She called Alina a sweet girl who got in over her head. She said nothing about Tomas Vasquez. She said nothing about the stolen partnership. She said nothing about the affair. but it didn't matter. The truth was out. And the truth, unlike Vivian's version of events, had receipts. The divorce proceedings began in July. Judith Crane was magnificent. She presented the full scope of Gregory's financial deception, the emotional abuse, the affair with Natasha, and the systematic isolation of Elena during her pregnancy. She also presented the historical claim, the documentation of the Vasquez partnership, and the argument that Elena's family was owed a debt that went far beyond alimony. Gregory's legal team tried every tactic in the book. They claimed Aliana had entrapped him. They claimed the Archbishop had violated the seal of confession. They claimed the historical documents were forgeries. None of it stuck. The evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses were credible. And the judge, a no-nonsense woman named Honorable Patricia Reeves, had no patience for what she called the spectacular arrogance of a man who tried to disown his own child at a baptism. The settlement was historic. Elena received full custody of McGear. She received the family home, not the mansion, which she didn't want, but a beautiful brownstone in Providence that Gregory had been using as an investment property. She received a substantial financial settlement that reflected both the marital assets and the historical claim. And she received something that no amount of money could buy, a public acknowledgement, written into the court record, that the Ashworth fortune had been built on the foundation of the Vasquez family's stolen labor and capital. Gregory was ordered to pay restitution, not just to Elena but to a trust fund established in Tomas Vasquez's name, designated for scholarships for first-generation immigrant students pursuing engineering and the trades. The judge called it a small measure of justice for a very old wrong. Gregory appealed. He lost. He appealed again. He lost again. The courts were done with him. Natasha Kensington disappeared from the story entirely. She deleted her social media. She left the country. There were rumors of her in Monaco, then London, then nowhere. She became a ghost, the kind of person who exists only in the wreckage of someone else's bad decisions. Vivian Ashworth retreated to the Berkshires estate and closed the gates. She stopped attending galas. She stopped giving interviews. The last anyone heard, she was selling paintings to cover legal fees. The irony was exquisite. The woman who had spent her entire life looking down on Elena's family was now, in her twilight years, experiencing the kind of financial precariousness she'd always sneered at. But this story isn't really about them. It was never about them. It's about Elena and Rosa and Miguel, and a man named Tomas Vasquez who came to this country with nothing but his hands and his honor and built something beautiful, only to have it stolen by someone who believed that wealth entitled him to decency. Elena went back to work, not at Medvance. That chapter was closed. She started her own firm, a biomedical engineering consultancy that specialized in designing affordable surgical tools for underserved hospitals. She staffed it with young engineers, many of them women, many of them first generation, many of them people who'd been told they didn't belong in rooms where decisions were made. She called the company Vasquez Engineering. She put her grandfather's name on the door. The patent royalties continued to grow. The cardiac microsuture tool she'd helped design was now being used in hospitals on 4 continents. Medical journals cited her work. Universities invited her to speak, and Elena accepted every invitation, not because she craved the spotlight, but because she remembered what it felt like to be invisible, and she never wanted another woman to feel that way. Rosa moved into the brownstone. She had her own room, her own garden, and her grandson down the hall. She still took in mending work, not because she needed the money, but because she liked the rhythm of it, the feel of needle and thread in her hands, the satisfaction of making something broken whole again. Some evenings Elena would find her mother in the kitchen, singing softly to Miguel, and the whole house would smell like Eras con Polo and lavender, and Elena would stand in the doorway and think, this is what home feels like. Archbishop Moreau continued to serve at St. Catherine's for another 3 years before retiring. At his farewell mass, the cathedral was packed. Standing room only, Elena sat in the front row with Miguel on her lap. The Archbishop, in his homily, spoke about justice. He spoke about patience. He spoke about the long arc of truth and how it bends, slowly but inevitably, toward the light. Afterward, Elena waited in line to say goodbye. When she reached the Archbishop, she took his hand and said, "You saved my son's life that day." The Archbishop shook his head gently. "No, my child, you saved it. Long before that day, you saved it by being his mother. I've just made sure the world knew what it was looking at." Elena leaned in and kissed the old man's ring. And then she whispered, so only he could hear, "My father would have liked you." The archbishop's eyes glistened. I know, he already told me. In a way, every time I look up at that choir loft. 2 years after the christening, David Chun published his book. It was called Silent Partners, The Hidden Immigrant Founders of American Fortunes. The Vasquez Ashworth case was the centerpiece. The book was reviewed in every major newspaper who won awards. It sparked a national conversation about credit, about legacy, about who gets remembered and who gets erased. Elena wrote the foreword. In it, she said, "My grandfather, Thomas Vasquez, never saw his name on a building. He never had a portrait in a boardroom. He never received a thank you letter or a profit-sharing check or even a handshake at the end. He died believing he had failed, but he didn't fail. He built something that lasted, and now, 60 years later, his grandson bears his name. His granddaughter carries his legacy, and the world finally knows the truth. Abuelo, this is for you. Every word, every brick, every beat of our hearts." And Miguel, little Miguel Thomas, Ashworth grew up in that brownstone in Providence, surrounded by love, and books, and the smell of his grandmother's cooking. He grew up hearing stories about his grandfather the carpenter, and his great-grandfather the builder, and his mother the engineer who once stood in a cathedral and refused to break. He grew up knowing exactly who he was and exactly where he came from, and when he was old enough to understand, Elena took him to St. Catherine's. She showed him the choir loft, the one his grandfather had built, every joint, perfect, every board level. She told him about the christening. She told him about the archbishop's promise. She told him about the moment his father tried to call him illegitimate, and the moment an old man in white vestments stood up and said, no. Miguel looked up at the choir loft for a long time. Then he looked at his mother and said, "Mum, do you think Grandpa Miguel can see it from heaven?" The loft, Elena smiled. "I think he can see everything, Mia. I think he's been watching this whole time. And maybe he was. Maybe Tomás was watching too. Maybe both of them, the carpenter and the builder, father and grandfather, two men who gave everything and received nothing. Maybe they were looking down at that little boy in that cathedral and finally, after all those years, feeling something they'd been denied in life. Asterisk recognition, vindication, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that their names, their real names, would not be forgotten again. Because that's the thing about the truth. You can bury it. You can build a mansion on top of it. You can dress it up in a charcoal suit and a pocket square and call it something else entirely. But the truth doesn't stay buried, it rises. Slowly, patiently, inevitably, like water through stone, like light through stained glass, like a baby's cry in a silent cathedral that rises, and when it does, no amount of money, no amount of power, no amount of cruelty or arrogance or carefully maintained lies can stand against it. Gregory Ashworth learned that the hard way. Vivian Ashworth learnt it too late. Natasha Kensington learnt it and ran. But Alina already knew. She'd known it her whole life. Her mother taught it to her. Her father lived it. Her grandfather died for it. The truth always wins. It just sometimes needs a little help getting to the altar, and on that Sunday in June, in St. Catherine's Cathedral, with holy water on her baby's forehead and 200 witnesses holding their breath, they got there, right on time. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the people in your own life who were underestimated, betrayed, or silenced, stay. There are more stories like this one. Stories about women who refused to break, about families who fought for their names, about moments when the truth walked into a room and changed everything. Subscribe, because next time, the story might be even harder to believe, and it will still be true.